Imagine being so rich that in Europe, your wealth was literally compared to an Argentine. In 1913, rich as an Argentine was a real expression used in France for someone with more money than they knew what to do with. And this wasn't a joke. Argentina was one of the richest countries on earth. Its elites lived in Paris, its cities rivaled Europe's wealthiest capitals, and its economy was growing at a pace that made the country look unstoppable. So how did a country that once represented unimaginable wealth become synonymous with economic crisis? That is the story of Argentina's spectacular rise, and even more spectacular collapse. Think about that for a second. The French, a nation that had spent centuries building one of the wealthiest empires on earth, looked across the Atlantic at a country most people today associate with economic crisis and inflation, and used it as their benchmark for extreme wealth. And they weren't exaggerating. In 1913, Argentina's income per person was genuinely higher than France's. It was nearly 5 times higher than Japan's. It ranked inside the top 10 richest economies on the entire planet, ahead of Germany, ahead of Italy, ahead of Spain. Today, Argentina's GDP per capita sits at a small fraction of France's. The country has defaulted on its debt 9 separate times, more than almost any nation on earth. It holds the record for the largest sovereign debt default in world history. Economists have a name for what happened here. They call it the Argentina paradox, and they use it as the textbook example of the sharpest, most complete collapse of a rich country in modern economic history. There's a reason economics departments around the world keep coming back to this specific case, rather than any of the dozens of other countries that have struggled economically over the past century. None of them fell quite this far, from quite this high, over quite this long a stretch of time. So here's the question worth actually digging into. How does a country that French aristocrats used as their measuring stick for wealth end up within roughly a century as a global case study in economic failure? What actually broke? Was it one catastrophic decision, or a century of smaller ones compounding on each other? And could it have been stopped at any point along the way? There's a version of this story you may have already half heard, something vague about corruption or bad luck, or a single populist leader who ruined everything. That version isn't entirely wrong, but it also badly understates how long, how gradual, and how genuinely complicated this decline actually was. Argentina's fall wasn't a single event. It was a slow-motion century, full of moments where a different choice might plausibly have changed the outcome, and by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly which choices those were and why. Time and again, Argentina made the one that didn't work. This is EndGame analysis. If you want the full data-backed answer instead of the vague version most people have heard, subscribe right now before we get into it, because this story has more turning points than almost any other national economic collapse we've covered on this channel. To understand how far Argentina actually fell, you first have to understand just how genuinely extraordinary its position was at the peak, because this wasn't a fluke or a temporary commodity spike. This was sustained world-leading economic performance for decades. Between 1875 and 1914, Argentina's GDP per capita grew at an average rate above 4% annually, one of the fastest sustained growth rates anywhere on the planet during that period. The population exploded alongside it, from roughly 2.5 million people in 1880 to nearly 12 million by 1930, driven by waves of European immigrants pouring into the country, specifically because of the economic opportunity it offered, drawn by wages and living standards that rivaled or exceeded what they could find back home. By 1913, Argentina's per capita income of roughly $4,519, measured in the historical dollar terms, economists use for these comparisons, exceeded France's $4,147, exceeded Germany's, and stood at nearly twice the level of Italy and almost 5 times that of Japan. Argentina trailed only a small handful of countries worldwide: Britain, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Switzerland, and Belgium. The wealth wasn't confined to a narrow elite either, at least not in the way that phrase usually implies. Working people had little trouble finding decent employment, housing, or education. The country's economy was built on an enormous and genuinely lucrative export engine, primarily beef, wheat, and leather, feeding a rapidly industrializing, increasingly hungry Europe. Buenos Aires itself became a physical monument to this wealth. Grand European-style boulevards, ornate architecture, opera houses, and public buildings that visitors today still describe as feeling closer to Paris than to the rest of Latin America. That comparison isn't accidental or coincidental. Argentina's elite were consciously building a European capital with Argentine money because, by every measure that mattered at the time, they had every reason to believe their prosperity was permanent. Argentina's economic weight extended well beyond its own borders during this period as well. By 1910, the country's GDP represented roughly 50% of the entire economic output of Spanish-speaking Latin America, combined, ranked 10th in the world's economy overall, and its trade activity accounted for roughly 7% of total global trade, an extraordinary share for a nation of Argentina's relatively modest population at the time. This wasn't a country coasting on a single lucky commodity boom either. Argentina had developed genuine industrial capacity alongside its agricultural export base, a functioning, increasingly urbanized economy that international observers of the era routinely placed in the same conversation as the wealthiest nations. In Western Europe and North America, not as an emerging market with potential, but as an economy that had, by most reasonable measures, already arrived. If you're the kind of person who wants to understand exactly how a story like this turns, subscribe to EndGame analysis now, because what happened over the following decades involved a genuinely fascinating and genuinely avoidable sequence of choices. Here's where Argentina's trajectory begins to separate from the other wealthy nations. Was standing alongside in 1913, and economists studying this history consistently point to the same starting period, the 1930s. The Great Depression hit the entire world hard, but it hit economies built heavily around commodity exports especially hard. And Argentina's prosperity had always rested substantially on exactly that foundation, agricultural exports to Europe. When global demand and prices for beef, wheat, and leather collapsed alongside the broader worldwide depression, Argentina's government responded not with the kind of painful but ultimately corrective restructuring some other nations eventually pursued, but with a pattern of unsustainable government spending and boom-bust economic management that economists studying the country's long-run data identify as the actual structural breakpoint, the moment Argentina's growth trajectory permanently diverged from the other wealthy nations it had been running alongside for decades. This is also the period when Argentina began pivoting away from the open, export-driven economic model that had built its original wealth in the first place, and toward a more state-directed protectionist approach, a shift that would deepen considerably in the following decades under a figure who remains one of the most consequential and most contested leaders in Argentine history, Juan Perón. Beginning in the 1940s, Perón's government pursued a significantly more state-led development model, nationalizing industries, expanding government intervention across large parts of the economy, and pursuing policies explicitly designed to reduce Argentina's traditional dependence on foreign trade and foreign capital. Whatever the intentions behind these policies, and there were genuine popular reasons Argentines supported them at the time, particularly around expanding labor rights and social protections, the practical effect over subsequent decades was an economy that grew increasingly insulated from the global trade and investment flows that had originally made it one of the richest countries on the planet. It's worth being fair to the actual complexity of this period, because it's easy, in hindsight, to treat every Peronist-era policy as an obvious mistake, when the reality was considerably messier at the time. Perón's government expanded labor protections, pensions, and social welfare programs that materially improved living conditions for large segments of the Argentine working class. And Perón himself remained, and in many ways remains today, genuinely popular among significant portions of the Argentine electorate precisely because of those improvements. The economic damage wasn't really located in any single policy taken in isolation. It was located in the cumulative, compounding effect of running large, persistent government deficits, protecting domestic industry from foreign competition well past the point where that protection was actually building competitive capacity, and steadily eroding the institutional habits of fiscal discipline that a smaller, more export-dependent economy like Argentina's needed to sustain over the long run. Between 1955 and 1976 alone, Argentina cycled through 4 democratic governments, none of which completed its full constitutional term, alongside a military-controlled civilian government and additional periods of outright military rule, a level of sustained political instability that made any kind of consistent, long-term economic policy planning extraordinarily difficult, regardless of which party or ideology happened to be nominally in charge at any given moment. By the 1970s, the structural weaknesses building since the 1930s collided with a genuinely brutal external shock, and Argentina's response to that shock set the country on a trajectory that would ultimately produce the largest sovereign debt default in world history. The 1970s global oil price shocks hit economies everywhere hard, but Argentina's government made a specific, consequential choice in response, rather than undertaking the kind of difficult, politically unpopular austerity measures that might have addressed the country's underlying fiscal weaknesses directly. It instead went heavily into dollar-denominated foreign debt, borrowing to paper over problems rather than confronting them. That decision set up the 1980s to become what's now widely referred to inside Argentina and in economic literature as the lost decade, a period defined by declining GDP, shrinking exports, and an increasingly desperate struggle to generate enough dollar revenue to service debt that kept compounding faster than the economy could grow to meet it. The mechanics of why this particular kind of borrowing proved so dangerous are worth understanding in a bit more detail, because the same basic trap has caught other countries in different eras since. Dollar-denominated debt means a country owes money and a currency it doesn't control and can't simply print more of if it runs short. As long as a country's exports keep generating a healthy stream of dollars, and as long as global interest rates stay low, that kind of borrowing can look perfectly manageable for years. But Argentina's export base, still heavily concentrated in agricultural commodities, decades after other wealthy nations had diversified into broader industrial and service-based economies, left it unusually exposed to swings in global commodity prices. Exactly the kind of swings the 1970s oil shocks and the broader economic turbulence of that decade produced repeatedly. Every time commodity export revenue dipped, Argentina's ability to service its growing dollar debt dipped along with it, and the government's answer, again and again through the late 1970s and 1980s, was simply to borrow more rather than restructure the underlying economy to reduce that vulnerability. Subscribe to EndGame analysis if you want the rest of this breakdown, because the 1990s attempt to fix all of this produced one of the more fascinating economic experiments of the late 20th century, and it's the part of this story most casual retellings skip entirely. By the end of the 1980s, decades of unsustainable spending and debt had produced genuine hyperinflation, a currency crisis in the most literal sense, with prices spiraling so far out of control that ordinary economic planning became close to impossible for both businesses and households. In 1991, Argentina's government implemented a dramatic solution, a currency board that pegged the Argentine peso to the US dollar at a fixed 1-to-1 rate, essentially importing the credibility and stability of American monetary policy directly into the Argentine economy. In the short term, it worked remarkably well. Hyperinflation ended almost immediately, and Argentina briefly became something of a darling of the international investment community throughout much of the 1990s, held up as a genuine success story of market-friendly reform, trade liberalization, deregulation, and privatization. But the peg came with a hidden compounding cost. By locking the peso to the dollar at a fixed rate, Argentina effectively surrendered its ability to adjust its own currency's value in response to changing economic conditions. And as the dollar strengthened globally through the 1990s, Argentine exports became steadily less competitive on world markets, dragging the broader economy toward recession even as the fixed exchange rate prevented the kind of natural currency adjustment that might have corrected the problem. Making matters considerably worse, Argentina's government never fully matched the discipline of the currency peg with equivalent discipline on the fiscal side. The IMF loans Argentina received throughout the 1990s were, by a considerable margin, the cheapest source of credit available to the government at the time, and that cheap credit created a strong, persistent incentive to keep borrowing and keep pressuring the IMF for additional financing, rather than confronting the harder structural adjustments the situation actually required. The country had solved one crisis, hyperinflation, by planting the seeds of the next one, a fixed exchange rate the underlying economy could no longer support once external conditions shifted against it. By 1999, Argentina was sliding into a deep and sustained recession, and by 2001, that recession had become a full-blown catastrophe that would ultimately define the country's economic reputation for the following generation. The numbers alone are staggering. Argentina's economy contracted by roughly 20%, a downturn economists have directly compared to the scale of the Great Depression in the United States, but compressed into a considerably shorter time frame. Unemployment climbed steadily as the fixed exchange rate continued strangling export competitiveness, even as the underlying fiscal and political situation deteriorated further. In December 2001, after years of accumulating pressure, the government imposed what became known as the Corralito, strict restrictions on how much cash depositors could withdraw from their own bank accounts, an attempt to prevent a full-scale bank run that instead triggered exactly the panic and social unrest it was meant to avoid. The political system collapsed alongside the economic one. President Fernando de la Rúa resigned in December 2001 amid mass protests and rioting in the streets of Buenos Aires. Argentina cycled through several presidents in the span of just a few weeks, as the political system struggled to find anyone willing or able to manage the unfolding catastrophe. By the time the dust settled, Argentina had defaulted on somewhere between $95 and $151 billion in sovereign debt, depending on which specific measure and time frame you use, the largest sovereign default the world had ever seen at that point in history. Bondholders eventually accepted a renegotiated settlement worth roughly 30% of the original face value of their holdings, an enormous, permanent loss that would go on to shape Argentina's relationship with international capital markets for the following 2 decades. The human cost behind those financial statistics deserves its own moment of attention because a 20% contraction in national output isn't an abstract number. It translates directly into millions of individual lives disrupted at once. Unemployment climbed into the high teens and beyond. Poverty rates, which had been relatively contained through much of the 1990s despite the underlying economic fragility, spiked dramatically as the crisis deepened, with credible estimates suggesting more than half of the Argentine population fell below the poverty line at the crisis's worst point. Middle-class families, who had spent years, in some cases decades, building savings, watched those savings effectively frozen or devalued overnight as the corralito. Restrictions and the eventual chaotic abandonment of the dollar peg wiped out purchasing power that had taken a lifetime to accumulate. The political instability that followed, 5 different presidents in the span of roughly 2 weeks at the height of the crisis, reflected genuine desperation inside a political system that had simply run out of conventional options. Even the eventual resolution of the crisis, painful as it was, offers its own lesson about the deeper pattern running through this entire story. Argentina's economy actually rebounded relatively quickly after 2002, driven substantially by a fresh commodity export boom, soybeans in particular, as global prices surged through the following decade. That rebound is worth noting precisely because of how familiar its underlying shape is. Once again, Argentina's fortunes rose and fell largely in step with global commodity prices, the exact same structural vulnerability that had exposed the country to the 1930s downturn, the 1970s oil shocks, and now the boom-bust cycle following 2001. A century after Argentina first became one of the richest countries on earth by exporting beef and wheat to Europe, the country's economy remained tied to essentially the same underlying vulnerability, dependence on commodity export revenue, that had made the original prosperity possible and later made it so fragile. Here's the detail that turns this from a single dramatic crisis story into something considerably more revealing about how Argentina's economy actually functions. 2001 wasn't an isolated catastrophe. It was the most dramatic entry in a much longer, much more troubling pattern. Argentina has defaulted on its sovereign debt 9 separate times throughout its history, a frequency that stands out even among the world's most debt-troubled economies. That kind of repeated pattern, rather than a single unfortunate crisis, points towards something structural rather than merely circumstantial, and academic research digging specifically into this question has landed on a consistent answer: institutional weakness. A detailed thesis examining the roots of Argentina's unsustainable debt patterns identified severe, persistent corruption, a dysfunctional revenue-sharing system between the federal government and Argentina's provinces that consistently undermined fiscal discipline, and a chronic, long-running absence of reliable rule of law as the actual underlying drivers behind decade after decade of debt crises, regardless of which specific administration or political ideology happened to be in power at any given moment. Subscribe to EndGame analysis now, because that institutional explanation is the piece of this story that actually matters most for understanding what comes next, and it's the part most surface-level coverage of Argentina's economy leaves out entirely. What that finding actually means is genuinely important, even when Argentina implemented policies that looked on paper like reasonable, even textbook responses to its problems, the market-friendly reforms of the 1990s, the currency board, trade liberalization. Those policies kept getting undermined by weaknesses in the underlying institutions responsible for actually enforcing and sustaining them over time. A good policy executed inside a system with severe corruption, unreliable rule of law, and chronic fiscal indiscipline between federal and provincial governments doesn't produce the same result as that same policy executed inside a system without those weaknesses. Argentina kept trying new economic strategies. The institutional cracks underneath those strategies kept swallowing the results. The federal-provincial revenue-sharing problem specifically deserves a moment of explanation because it's a mechanism most people outside Argentina have never heard of, and it's a genuinely significant ongoing driver of the country's fiscal instability. Argentina's system for distributing tax revenue between the national government and its individual provinces has, for decades, created persistent incentives for provincial governments to spend beyond their means while relying on the federal government, and by extension, the national currency and the national debt, to eventually cover the gap. That dynamic makes genuine, sustained fiscal discipline extraordinarily difficult to maintain, even when the national government in Buenos Aires is, at any given moment, sincerely committed to it, because provincial spending decisions made largely outside federal control keep generating fiscal pressure that eventually has to be absorbed somewhere in the national accounts. It's exactly the kind of structural institutional weakness that doesn't show up clearly in a single crisis narrative, but that shows up reliably, decade after decade, in Argentina's recurring pattern of debt problems, regardless of which specific economic ideology happens to be in fashion in any given administration. Step back and look at the full arc of this story in aggregate, and the scale of the reversal becomes almost impossible to overstate. Between 1928 and 2000, while the world's other wealthy nations, Britain, the United States, Canada, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Australia, roughly quadrupled their per capita income, and Germany, France, and Sweden quintupled theirs, Argentina barely grew at all over that same 72-year span. Even Brazil, a country that stood well behind Argentina economically for most of the 20th century, managed to outperform it over this stretch. Today, Argentina's GDP per capita sits at roughly $12,667, a level economists studying the country's long-run trajectory note. It took Argentina until the year 2000 to simply match a milestone the rest of the world's wealthy Convergence Club nations had already passed decades earlier. That's the full weight of the Argentina paradox in a single comparison. A country that was, by every reasonable measure available in 1913, one of the handful of richest nations on Earth, richer than France, richer than Germany, nearly on par with the United States, spent the following century falling not just behind its original peer group, but behind countries that had started the 20th century considerably poorer than it was. Pull back from the specific dates and defaults, and the real lesson of Argentina's collapse isn't really about any single policy mistake, even though several genuinely consequential ones show up clearly across this timeline. It's about what happens when a country's underlying institutions, the reliability of its rule of law, the discipline of its fiscal and political systems, the absence of entrenched corruption, aren't strong enough to sustain good policy even when good policy actually gets chosen. Argentina's 20th century offers something close to a natural experiment in this exact question. The country tried protectionism under Perón. It tried market liberalization and privatization in the 1990s. It tried a hard currency peg to eliminate inflation. It tried, at various points, nearly every major economic strategy in the modern policy playbook, and nearly all of them, over a long enough time frame, ran into the same underlying institutional weaknesses that kept converting reasonable policy choices into eventual crisis. That's a genuinely different and genuinely more useful lesson than simply blaming a single leader, a single ideology, or a single decade. The Argentina paradox isn't really a story about one wrong turn. It's a story about a country that kept trying to outrun a structural problem with a new policy each generation without ever fully addressing the institutional foundation underneath all of them. There's a reason this particular case study gets cited so consistently in economics departments and policy circles well beyond Argentina's own borders, and it isn't simply because the fall was dramatic. It's because Argentina's experience directly challenges a comfortable assumption. A lot of economic thinking quietly relies on the idea that once a country reaches a certain level of wealth and development, sustained decline of this magnitude simply doesn't happen anymore. That the Convergence Club of rich nations is effectively a one-way door. Argentina spent much of the 20th century as living proof that it isn't. Wealth, once achieved, still has to be actively defended by institutions strong enough to survive bad decades, not just good ones. And a country that gets the growth right for 50 years can still lose the following 50 if that underlying institutional foundation was never actually built to last. If this breakdown gave you a clearer, more complete picture of how one of the world's richest countries fell this far, subscribe to EndGame analysis, because we're going to keep tracking Argentina's current economic reform efforts and whether this time actually breaks the century-long pattern. Tell me in the comments, do you think Argentina's institutional problems can genuinely be fixed at this point, or is this simply the country's permanent economic reality now? I read every comment, and they shape what we cover next. One final number worth leaving you with, because it captures this entire story better than any single crisis on its own could. It took Argentina until the year 2000, nearly a full century after it stood among the 10 richest nations on Earth, to simply reclaim the relative economic position most of its original 1913 peer group had already left behind decades earlier. A century isn't a policy failure. It's several generations of Argentines living through the consequences of choices made long before most of them were born, which is exactly why understanding how this actually happened matters, for Argentina and for any country tempted to assume that today's prosperity is permanent. This has been EndGame Analysis. Stay sharp.